Hello, GMS students. This is Mr. Friedman, your math coach. In today's lesson, we are going to be looking at adding and subtracting fractions. So before you begin today's lesson, please open up the guided notes, which should be loaded onto Google Classroom. If you have a printer, you may print them out. If you do not have a printer, please copy down the two examples onto a piece of paper and follow along with me. So example 1. We want to do 1/3 plus 1/4. Now, when I add fractions, we never ever add denominators. Do not add the 3 and the 4. Do not say that the answer is 2/7. We cannot add denominators when we add fractions. What we have to do when we add fractions is make sure that we have a common denominator. That means my two denominators have to be equal in order to add the fractions. So in this case, I do not have a common denominator. I have a denominator of 3 and a denominator of 4. So we are going to have to create equivalent fractions with a common denominator. If you think back a few lessons ago, we created equivalent fractions by multiplying. So the first thing I'm going to have to do is determine what would be my least common denominator. What is the smallest number that both 3 and 4 can go into? Well, that's going to be my least common multiple of 3 and 4. Now, you learned a method earlier in the year where you listed out the common multiples of 3 and 4 and then circled the smallest one. In this case, I'm going to see if I can just figure this out without listing them all out. What would be the smallest multiple of 3 and 4, the smallest number that both of these can go into? The answer is going to be 12. 3 can go into 12. 12 is a multiple of 3. 12 is also a multiple of 4. So what I'm going to do now is create equivalent fractions. Let's start with 1/3. I need to make 1/3 into something over 12. Okay, so to go from 3 to 12, I'm do times 4. To go, and whatever I do to the denominator, I must do the same to the numerator. So times 4 in the numerator, 1 times 4 gives me 4. Okay, I also now want to make my second fraction out of 12. So 1/4. Let's make that instead have a denominator of 12. 4 times what gives me 12? That's going to be 4 times 3. 4 times 3 is 12. Whatever I do to the denominator, I do the exact same to the numerator. So times 3 in the numerator. 1 times 3 gives me 3. Okay, so what I've now done is created equivalent fractions. 1/3 is the same as 4/12. 1/4 is the same as 3/12. These two fractions I can now add. So I'm rewriting now my 1/3 plus 1/4 as 4/12 plus 3/12. Do you see now I do have a common denominator? Okay. Now when I add these fractions, what I'm going to do is I leave my denominator alone and I just add my numerators. 4 plus 3 is 7. So my answer to this problem is 7/12. One final step, let's check to see if I can simplify. Can 7/12 be simplified? The answer is I cannot. 7 is a prime number. There's nothing I can divide it by. So my answer is good to go, 7/12. Now let's look at example 2, 1/5 plus 3/10. So first step, find a common denominator. These do not yet have a common denominator, so I'm going to have to change and find equivalent fractions. What is my least common denominator or least common multiple of 5 and 10? The answer is 10, right? 5 does go into 10. 10 is a multiple of 5, okay? So in this case, I don't need to change this 3/10. I'm just going to circle this because I'm going to leave this one alone. I only need to change 1/5. I need to make 1/5 to be some fraction out of 10. Okay, so 5 times what gives me 10? That's going to be times 2. Whatever I do to the denominator, I also do to the numerator. 1 times 2 is 2. So I've changed 1/5 into 2/10. But I'm going to leave this 3/10 just as it was. I don't need to change that. Okay, so my numbers I'm now going to add are 2/10 plus 3/10. You see, I now have common denominators. I leave my denominator alone. I leave that 10 alone and add my numerators to give me 5/10. Okay, we are almost done here, but this fraction can be simplified. There is a number that I can divide both of these by. There is a common factor that I can divide both the 5 and the 10 by. And that number is 5. I can divide both of these by 5. So let's do that now. 5 divided by 5 gives me 1. 10 divided by 5 gives me 2. So my answer to this problem is 1/2. And now you are ready to begin today's lesson.